deal?
Canada's UN ambassador and exiled Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya earlier on the show, outlining Putin's threat to the world after a Putin opponent, Alexei Navalny, died in jail. After 2 years of Western sanctions aimed at deterring the Russian leader, is this a sign of an emboldened Vladimir Putin? And what are the political consequences of Canada's response now? Let's bring in the front bench. Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's now principal at Shakti Strategies. Melanie Paradis is a former communications director for Aaron O'Toole. She's now the president of Texture Communications. Former Ontario NDP MPP Guratan Singh. He's now the vice president at Crestview Strategy. He's also the brother of federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh and CTV News senior digital parliamentary reporter Rachel Aiello. All right, Sabrina, let's start with you. The Prime Minister called Putin a monster today, and Canada's ambassador to the UN says we need to double down on sanctions and our resolve. What more do you think that looks like in your mind?
I think it has to be coordinated, not just from a Canadian perspective, but you have to look at what NATO is going to do and what the United States is going to do. And I think it's positive to see that both Canada and the United States came out so strongly today between Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden, came out so strongly against Putin and kind of declared him a monster, declared this death to be solely on his hands. I think where we go from here is still interesting. I don't think that the Western countries or the Western allies have necessarily thought through a further strategy on where they either strengthen their investments in Ukraine, whether they start to deliver more, military support in a different way. I think that's still to be seen. But I think the most important thing that has to be clear in Canada and the United States is that Vladimir Putin is a significant threat. And, you've seen polling come out recently in Canada that says that nearly 43% of people, mostly on the conservative side, think we're doing too much in Ukraine. We cannot underplay what a Vladimir Putin or Russian victory looks like in Russia and Ukraine. And I think that has to be the number one job of governments in the West.
Melanie, I'm sure you want to address that. I'm going to get to that in our second round. First, I want to ask you, can or should Canada be a leader on this fight in terms of sanctions or other response to Putin here?
Yes, we absolutely can. And we can help provide the rest of the world with some of the goods that they've been depending on Russia for. So mineral supply, for example. Russia is a big provider of minerals around the world. We should be providing those instead to everyone by getting our minds open and online. Ukraine has been fighting this war for the past 2 years with what is effectively a yard sale of items from the United States military, from Canada, from NATO. They need real support. It's long overdue for Canada and the rest of the world to step up and to help Ukraine win this war decisively and send a very clear message to Vladimir Putin that we aren't going to stand for this anymore, and we are not going to let him walk all over a democracy.
Yeah, Guratan, the government says that sanctions work, but the Russian GDP numbers say otherwise. So should allies be looking at other things right now to really hit Putin where it hurts?
I think this is a clear sign that allies across the board, from NATO to anyone who actually supports and believes in upholding democracy, needs to take decisive action right now and continue their support unequivocally for Ukraine. And it is actually incredibly concerning when we do see here in Canada, there already are cracks in that kind of support. When you see the Conservatives voting against free trade with Ukraine, when you see the Conservatives saying a Conservative government would reduce foreign aid, when you see that kind of rhetoric happening in large segments of our of the Conservative base, frankly, and it doesn't take into account how important victory for Ukraine is, not just for democracy, not just for justice, not just for equality, but actually for all of us. Because a win for Putin will create further destabilization. It is a blow for democracy, and it's a win for a heinous dictator. And a win for Ukraine demonstrates that together people can support democratic nations and uphold the rule of law. This is a truly decisive time that we're in right now, and we need unequivocal support for Ukraine.
Yeah, Rachel, and some of that support was expressed online by the Canadian political leaders, but their responses were a little bit different.
Yeah, what was really interesting to me today was wondering if this was going to be kind of like the start of the war, a galvanizing, unionizing moment where all sides come together and show that united front in support of Ukraine and against Russia. And not to say that didn't happen, but it was interesting to see Poilievre today was saying very plainly, matter of fact, Navalny has died in prison. Conservatives condemn Putin for his death. One of his MPs, Garnet Jenis, went further in saying that the despicable murder was done by Vladimir Putin. Obviously, we discussed what the Prime Minister suggested. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh talking about how he was killed for his exposure of corruption.
Right.
So what I'm going to be watching for heading into, I guess, when the House comes back a week from now, is what More Canada does and whether those further actions are supported by all parties, full-throatedly backing Canada's condemnation of this and further measures? Or is it going to be another situation where there are caveats for reasons why the Conservatives pull their support?
Yeah, and that support that we had seen when either Zelensky was here virtually or in person. Melanie, I'm going to bring you back in here because there was a lot of talk about that fatigue and where it was seen. I know that Sabrina had mentioned that a lot of it looked like it was Conservative voters. Maybe A, respond to that, but B, talk a little bit about the fatigue and how difficult it is to maintain that support on this side of the ocean.
So Russian disinformation is an incredibly powerful tool that we have no concept of how pervasive it has been in Canadian society, except perhaps seeing some of these polling results. The world was a very different place 5 years ago. I think people felt very different. And 2 years ago when the war started, people felt very differently. I personally think that Russian disinformation has had an incredible impact on the average Canadian. Far beyond what we've been able to assess. And it should be something that every parliamentarian is very concerned about. I think that there are probably some parliamentarians, frankly, who have been impacted by Russian disinformation. And we should all be very concerned about that. And I hope that every party looks internally to their caucus and considers if there are people among them who have perhaps come across information that is in fact disinformation, and that needs to be corrected. And they need to be educated on what is happening with Ukraine and what the Russians have really been up to for years. Their propaganda machinery is incredible. And I think that the Canadian government and each of the opposition parties would be well served to start informing Canadians more plainly about what exactly we're up against here.